Good morning, students. Today's topic is education as a economic good. This topic's objectives are increase investment in the quality of primary schooling given that primary education has expanded exponentially already. Promote educational efficiency in policy through policymakers and government. Reform school management systems and implement more effective performance metrics. Implement more effective and fair approaches to school funding. Report more data on school performance. These are the objectives of this topic. And next, the education economic. Education economics or the economics of education is the study of economic issues relating to education, including the demand for education, the financing and provision of education, and the comparative efficiency of various educational programs and policies. From early workers on the relationship between schooling and labor market outcomes for individuals. The field of the economic of education has grown rapidly to cover virtually all areas with linkage to education. And the next is the education as an investment. Economic distinguish in additional to physical capital, another form of capital that is no less critical as a means of production, human capital. And with investments in human capital, such as education, three more major economic effects can be expected. And the increase expenses as the accumulation of human capital requires. Investments, just as physical capital does, increase productivity as people gain characteristics that enable them to produce more output and hence return on investment in the form of higher incomes. And the next is the investment costs. Investments in human capital entail an investment cost, just as any investment does. Typically, in Europe countries, most education expenditure takes the form of government consumption, although some costs are some borne by individuals. And these investments can be rather costly. EU governments spend between 3% and 8% of GDP on education in 2005, the average being 5%. However, measuring the spending this way alone greatly underestimates the cost because a more suitable form of cost is completely overlooked. The opportunity cost of foregone wages as students cannot work while they study. It has been estimated that the total costs, including opportunity costs of education, are as much as double the direct costs, including opportunity costs. Investments in education can be estimated to have been around 10% of GDP in the EU countries in 2005. In comparison, investments in physical capital were 20% of GDP. And the next point is this return on investment. Return on investments, human capital in the form of education, shares many characteristics with physical capital. Both require an investment to create and once created. Both have economic value. Physical capital earn a return because people are willing to pay to use a piece of physical capital in work as it allows them to produce more output, and that to measure the productive value of physical capital, we can simply measure how much of a return it commands in the market. In the case of human capital, calculating returns is more complicated. After all, we cannot separate education from the person to see how much it rents for. And next to measure the productive value of physical capital. We can simply measure how much of return it commands in the market. In the case of human capital, calculating returns is more complicated. After all, we cannot separate education from the person to see how much it rents for. This is the to get around this problem. The returns to human capital are generally inferred from differences in wages among people with different levels of education. And the next is this picture. This picture is free goods. Definition: any good whose quantity is sufficient to all satisfy all over wants, that is, it is not scarce, as people do not prefer to have more of it. They will not pay for it or to give up something to get it. The opportunity cost of it in production is zero. So, the 9-year free education is not a free good. And the next is effects of productivity. Economy wide, the effect of human capital on incomes has been estimated to be rather significant. 65% of wages paid in developed countries is payments to human capital, and only 35% to raw labor. And the higher productivity of well educated workers is one of the factors that explain higher GDPs and therefore higher incomes in developed countries. A strong correlation between GDP and education is clearly visible among the countries of the world. And to distinguish the part of GDP explained with education for explain education from other causes. Well, has calculated how much one would expect each country's GDP to be higher based on the data on average schooling. This was based on the above mentioned calculation of Hall and Jones on the returns on education. In GDPs predicted by Will calculations can be plotted against actual GDPs as is done in the figure on the left, demonstrating that the variation in education explains some but not all of the variations in GDP. And the next is finally the matter of externalities should be considered. Usually, when speaking of externalities, one thinks of the negative effects of economic activities that are not included in market prices, such as pollution. And the finally, the market price, these are the negative extreme needs. However, there are also positive externalities, that is, positive effects of which someone can benefit without having to pay for it. And the next is education bearers. With it, measure positive externalities. Giving one person more education rises not only his or her output, but also the output of those around him or her. Educated workers can bring new technologies, methods, and informations to the consideration of others, and they can teach things to others and act as an example. The positive externalities of education include the effects of personal networks and the roles educated workers play in them. And the next is positive externality. Positive externality from human capital are one explanation for why governments are involved in education. If people were left on their own, they would not take into account the full social benefit of education. In other words, the rise in the output and wages of others, so the amount they would choose too often would be lower than the social optimum. And these are the positive externality in this type of social optimums. And the next is the demand for education. Demand for education is the liberal approaches. The dominant model of the demand for education is based on human capital theory. The central idea is that undertaking education is investment in the acquisition of skills and knowledge which will increase earnings or provide long term benefits, such as an appreciation of literature, sometimes referred as cultural capital. These are the An increase in human capital can follow technological process as knowledgeable employees are in demand due to the need for their skills, whether it be in understanding the production process or in operating machines. These demand of education and the studies from 1958 attempted to calculate the returns from additional schooling. The percentage increase in income acquired through the additional year of schooling. Later results attempt to allow for different returns across persons or by level of education. This the level of education is statistics have shown that countries with high enrollment graduation rates have grown faster than countries without. The United States has been the world leader in educational advances, beginning with the high school movement 1910 to 1950. And there also seems to be a correlation between gender difference in education with the level of growth, more development is observed in countries that have an equal distribution of the percentage of women versus men who graduated from high school. And the when looking at correlations in the data, education seems to generate economic growth. However, it could be that we have this causality relationship backwards. For example, if education is seen as a luxury good, it may be that richer households are seeking out educational entertainment as a symbol of status rather than the relationship of education leading to wealth. And this is the picture importance of economic growth. Economic growth or higher tax revenue public sector investment, private sector investment, and increased productive capacity. These are all the economic growth importance. And the next is Marxist critic. Although Marx and Engels did not write widely about the social functions of education, their concepts and methods are theorized and criticized by the influence of Marx as education being used in reproduction of capitalist societies. Marx and Engels approached scholarship as revolutionary scholarship, where education should serve as a propaganda for the struggle of the working class. The Marxist critique, the classical Marxist paradigm sees education as serving the interest of capital and is seeking alternative modes of education that would prepare students and citizens for more progressive society, socialist mode of social organizations. And the next is the Marx and Engels understood education and free time as essential to developing the free individuals and creating many seated human being. Thus, for them, education should the become a more essential part of the life of pupil, unlike capitalist society, which is organized mainly around work and the production of commodities. And the next is financing and provision. In most countries, school education is predominantly financed and provided by governments. Public funding and provision also play a major role in higher education. Although there is wide agreement on the principle that education, at least at a school level, should be financed mainly by governments. There is considerable debate over the desirable extent of public provision of education. Is the financing provision and supporter of public education argue that universal public provisions promotes equality of opportunities and social coherence. And the next, the picture economic growth. These all are included in economic growths, increase in employment, increase in revenue, increased consumption, fall in unemployment, increased spending on public services, and encourages investment. These are all are the economic growth. And the next is primary education, pre-primary education financing compared to other areas of basic education. Globally, comparable data on pre-primary education financing remain scarce. While much of existing non-formal and private programs may not be fully accounted for, it can be deduced from the level of provision that pre-primary financing remains inadequate, especially when considered against expected benefits. And these the globally pre-primary education accounts for the lowest proportion of the total public expenditure on education. In spite of the much documented positive impact of quality early childhood care and education on later learning and other social outcomes. And the next point picture is shown benefits of economic growth. Increased life expectancy, improved government finances, higher incomes, reduced poverty, and better education. These are the benefits of economic growth. economic growth is high, the better education is reduced poverty, higher income, improved government finances, and increased life expectancies. These are the benefits. And the next is the education production functions. Education production function and education production function is an application of the economic concept of a production function to the field of education. It relates various inputs affecting a student's learning, schools, families, peers, neighborhoods, etc., to measured outputs, including subsequent labor market success, college attendance, graduation rates, and most frequently, standardized test score. And the original study that even naturally promoted interests in the idea of education production functions was by a sociologist, James C. Coleman. And the report of the Coleman report, published in 1966, concluded the marginal effect of various school inputs on student achievement was small compared to the impact of families and friends. Later work by Heinrich A. Hanushek, Richard Moroney, and other economists introduced the structures of production to the consideration of student learning outcomes. And these outcomes, Hanusek had reported a very high correlation between adjusted growth rate and adjusted test scores. And these are a large number of successive studies increasingly involving economists produced inconsistent results about the impact of school resources on student performance, leading to considerable controversy in policy discussion. The interpretation of the various studies has been very controversial, in part because the findings have directly influenced policy debates, and two large separate lines of a study have been particularly widely debated. The overall questions of whether added funds to schools are likely to produce higher achievement, and the money does not matter. Debate has entered into legislative debates and court consideration of school finance systems. And additionally, policy discussions about class size reduction, heightened academic study of the relationship of the class size and achievement. And globally, pre primary education accounts for the lowest proportion of the total public expenditure on the education in spite of the much documented positive impact of quality early childhood care and education on later learning and other social outcomes. And the education is the original study that even naturally promoted interest in the idea of education production function was a sociologist, the Coleman. Coleman is prepared to the other areas of basic education and the globally comparable data on pre-primary education and the financing remains scarce while much of existing non-formal private programs may not be fully accounted for. It can be deduced from the level of position that primary pre-primary financing remains inadequate, especially when considered against expected benefits. And these are the additional policies discussion about the class size reduction, high, heightened academic study of the relationship of class size and achievement. These are the main education result about the impact of school resources. And the end of this topic, see the references of these topics. These are the references. your help more study in this topic. And at the end of this topic, some multiple choice question is there. First question is, which of the following could not be considered a major economic system? Capitalism, communism, socialism, and physical quality of life index. The right answer of this question is physical quality of life index. And the next question, economic development refers to economic growth. Economic growth plus changes in output, distribution, and economic structure. Improvement in the well being of the urban population. Sustainable increases in growth, gross, and national product. What is the right answer? The right answer is sustainable increases in gross national product. This is the right answer of this question. And next question is, OPEC is the organization of petroleum exporting country, organization of pre-European Commission, oil producing economies, causes, organization of problematic economies committee. The right answer is organization of pre-European Commission. This is the right answer of this question. And the next question is, PPP is, first option is where a theory that tells us that exchange rates between currencies are in equilibrium when their purchasing power is the sum in both countries, and GDP divided by exchange rate, and a measure of economic inequality. And the next option is a measure of infant morali- mortality in developing countries. The right answer of this question is a measure of infant mortality in developing countries. And the next question, in the physical quality of life index, PQLI, in combines three indicators. They are infant, infant mortality, life expectancy, and Life expectancies and adult literacy rate, crime rate, clean environment, and quality of housing, air pollution rate, water pollution rate, and sanitation, health, education, and environment. What is the answer? The answer of this question is health, education, sorry, air pollution rate, water pollution rate, and sanitation. C option is the right answer of this question. And next question is infant mortality is defined as the annual number of deaths of infant under 1 year old per 1000 live births, reflects the availability of primary education, the rights of employment and social security, and his life expectancy up to age 3. And the last option is reflects the availability of hospitals and child care facilities and the parents' wealth. The right answer of this question is life expectancy up to age 3. And next question, ancient refer to the Association of Southeast Agro Nations, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Alliance of Southeast Asian Neighbors, Alliance of Southeastern African Nations. The right answer of this question is Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And next question, and the last question is as economic development proceeds, income equality trend tend to follow. Dash, dash, Q, curve, a convex. First option is a convex inverted U shaped, L shaped, and S shaped. What is the right answer of this question? The right answer of this question is a inverted U shaped. B option is the right answer of this question. This is the all about the topic education as a economic good. At the end of this topic is thank you.